I'm just turning off my phones and my do not disturb, so y'all have my undivided attention.
Well, thank you so much for that. Good afternoon. It's great to see everybody today. I am so pleased to introduce our speaker for this month's installment of the Better Together webinar. Julie, I'm going to let you know we've got a ton of people signed on today and probably more on YouTube. So we're just really grateful to you for putting together such what I know is going to be an informative and helpful presentation today. I am so pleased to introduce Julie Tim, the CEO of GRTC, the Greater Richmond Transit Company, and a partner of PlanRVA. As many people out there probably know, PlanRVA is the home for supporting the Regional Transportation Planning Program, the MPO, or the Richmond Regional Transportation Planning Organization. GRTC is a member of that organization and an active partner with us on thinking about how we can fulfill the region's transportation needs going into the future. So, Julie, I'm going to turn it over to you now without much ado. From a format perspective, for those of you that are tuning in for the first time, Julie will be sharing her screen. I will be with my colleagues in the background, kind of monitoring the chat and the Q&A. So feel free to start typing your questions in, and when we get to near the end of the hour, at the conclusion of Julie's presentation, we'll be able to take questions from the audience. Julie, over to you.
Thank you. Okay, so we should have a share go on right now. You should be able to see my the PowerPoint. Awesome. Okay, perfect. That's I love that we're able to reach so many more people with these Zoom webinars. The people that wouldn't be able to come out in person can watch it. The problem is that you don't get that in-person interaction to hear when people are saying, huh, or saying they can't see the slides. So hopefully, if you can't hear, you can't see, Martha or Sid or someone will pop on the screen and say, Julie, we need you to speak louder or move the screen forward. So I just appreciate everyone's technical assistance. After 2 years of COVID and using these, I still forget to unmute myself too often. Okay, so this presentation, it's 17 slides. I'm not sure, I think I have them numbered, so you can, as we go forward, wondering if this, how much more there is to see. Remember that magic number, there's 17 slides. This presentation was put together by my team. I have a wonderful team here at GRTC that does planning for operations, for transit, for mobility, for future accessibility to our region. And we have a consultant group that's also working with them, Michael Baker and Foursquare, and they have done an amazing job taking us forward in this micro-mobility study. But I think that to start, I'm going to show a slide here. Let's see if I can do this. Okay, here we go. It's working now. This is actually a picture from Nashville. I was in Nashville for several years, and I love the quote. They used it out there for their transit alliance, that if you always do what you've always done, you always get what you've always got. It's a great quote, Henry Ford. I think that we in transit use this a lot to talk about why we need to do more than just widen our roads. Just widen our roads doesn't have the answer. But I think it's really relevant for us to consider this ourselves in transit, that too often transit does the same thing. When we always do what we've always done, everything, when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Well, when you run transit and you run bus service, everything looks like a bus line. And that's not where GRTC is heading. We really are looking at how we can provide a more comprehensive suite of mobility services. It's more than just a local bus. And that's where this micro-mobility study comes in. And it's where we need to be better together, where we need to be looking at our local partners, our jurisdictional partners, our riders, our non-riders, and how we can serve the community in RVA better, serve those mobility needs that may be through a 40-foot bus, but maybe is something else. So a little bit about GRTC first. GRTC, we have pre-COVID, we were on target to serve 10 million trips in 2021. Of course, we're not on that anymore, but our local bus service is back to pre-pandemic levels. And there's a lot of reasons for that. We won't go into it in this presentation, but it's just to say that we are the third largest transit agency in the state. We do have a large service area. We serve the RVA region, but predominantly we're serving about 500,000 people within Richmond, Henrico, and some of Chesterfield. Our service is mostly focused on that local bus, but we also do commuter bus, and we also do bus rapid transit. The Pulse was an amazing addition to this region in 2018 before I got here. And I think it signaled a pivot in how this region does transit and how this region is funding mobility. So really love the Pulse and what it represents for mobility here. And we do paratransit. That's for people who have different abilities who aren't able to regularly or easily access our local bus or our Pulse. This is a door-to-door service for people to also have access under ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act. And we have the commuter service that goes all the way to Petersburg. Sometimes it goes to Kings Dominion pre-COVID, goes out to Enrico, goes out to Chesterfield to bring some of the suburban and rural folks from parking rides into the city, access jobs, and some reverse commute. And we have Vanpool. I think most people don't know that that the Vanpool program that we have here is part of GRTC. It's operated and managed beautifully by Vaughn, who is over that. Many of you probably know her, and she coordinates the business model for Vanpools here. That is part of the GRTC model, and we hope to leverage some of those moving forward under the microtransit service. And we help coordinate carpools, and we're looking for that multimodal connections. How do we connect up with bike share, and how do we connect up with the trails? Very excited about the new trail that's coming through the region. That's what we do, and we do it very, very well and very, very effectively. I think we don't communicate that as well as we could, but that's who GRTC is. And when we had the BRT come in play in 2018, and we had our system, our local system redesigned in 2018, we really set the stage for doing more better. But the question is that what does all that mean? That's a lot of words. We do transit. What does that mean, and what does that look like? How are we serving the region? Mobility serves to connect people. It connects people to their homes and their jobs. And that's predominantly what we do. When we look at our origin destination survey, the vast majority of people who use transit currently are using it to get to and from work. We have some that use it for jobs, education, healthcare, food, shopping, all the range of resources that we all need to be have health and welfare and our prosperity in our communities. We connect them to all that, but predominantly it's to jobs. What we're hearing, though, is that there is a stronger need for mobility beyond just the connection to jobs, that there are senior rides that need to be happening out in rural communities where transit doesn't serve as well, where a 40-foot bus just doesn't make sense. So when we look at mobility services, when we look at what GRTC provides, when we start talking about microtransit in particular, we want to see, is there a gap? Is there a gap? We're not everything. We're not the hammer, and the mobility is not the nail, but there's something else going on here. So microtransit, what is microtransit? I think it's the buzzword we're all looking at right now. How do we get people more connected to more services? And when we look at microtransit, it actually has a broad range of services that it can help provide throughout the region. It's not just for the urban, it's not just for the suburban, it's not just for the rural. So when we look at three kind of key areas of kinds of microtransit, there's one that's neighborhood circulation. So I kind of think about this might be an area where we currently have a bus. It might be an area where we've never had transit, but people need to get around within a small area to get from, maybe it's a senior who's living in the community and just needs to be able to get 5 miles down the road to a grocery store or get to the pharmacy. They don't need to go much further than that, but they don't have a good way to connect to those resources. Maybe it's a place where we do have transit, but the ridership's low, the need's there, but they need to be able to get to resources, and the cost of doing it with a 40-foot bus just doesn't make sense. So maybe we can do a smaller vehicle or a circulator that might be on a fixed route, or maybe it's a flexible route that connects people from their homes to those resources or to the transit system, the larger transit system. We also look at this idea about first and last mile connections. I think about these as the lollipop areas, and that's just the way my mind works. But if you think about it, if we have a fixed route, most people who ride local bus service going to and from work are accessing that service within 2 or 3 blocks. Some will go a little bit further, but most of it's very, very close to where that system is. And so unless you have buses everywhere, a lot of people, if they live further away from a major corridor, might not be able to easily connect into transit. So when you look at microtransit, you look at ways to have like maybe a little lollipop, or a little bit the head of the lollipop that brings people from a larger area back into that transit line. It can be around a park and ride, where maybe someone doesn't have a car to get to a park and ride, but maybe we have a service that brings people to that park and ride, and then they can use the commuter bus to come in. They can use that high frequency transit to come in. It just extends the range of people who have access to traditional transit to either get from home or to work or to the hospital or to the pharmacy. And then of course, the other kind of microtransit is this on-demand service, which a lot of us are familiar with either people who use paratransit. We have that on-demand service now with our ADA community, but it's also the Ubers and the Lyfts would fall into this category. The senior rides that we're starting to see some senior ride programs, not starting, they've been there, in communities that don't have traditional transit, a bus, they're providing volunteer-based or community-based or even county-based senior ride services to get people from their home, people especially who might have less ability to drive a car or less money to own a car, but they still have to be able to get to the pharmacy, they have to get their food, they have to get their hair appointments, that connectivity. And that's that demand response to kind of don't just drive the bus around waiting for someone to get on it, but have someone call in, pick them up, drop them off, and do that demand response. So those are the kinds of microtransit models that when we talk about microtransit, we're really looking at. It's very broad. So what does this mean now? Okay, what are the benefits of it? When we look at the benefits of typical microtransit, again, it goes back to those different models. So where we talked a little bit about the neighborhood circulators, we do have a couple of our routes that they're in areas of high density and they have need, but the ridership is relatively low. Now, we don't want to take away the transit service. We don't want to create a hole where people can no longer have mobility access, but providing that transit service through a 40-foot bus and the money that goes into a fixed route, high frequency route in those neighborhoods maybe doesn't make sense. There's a way to leverage those resources through microtransit to replace the underperforming route and make it higher performing, higher functioning. So that's one thing that we can use microtransit for when we look inside our current system. How do we leverage our resources more efficiently, more effectively, and still give people that access? We talked about the first mile, last mile connections. The first mile that kind of can increase the range of who can reach transit and who can get to jobs. And we look about new service areas. Not only are we looking within where we currently have transit, but where are we not serving that maybe there needs to be more connectivity where people are being left behind because they don't have a car and they don't have access to transit. They don't have access to Ubers and Lyft because there's a hole there. These are the kinds of benefits that we would be looking out of implementing one of those service models in the region. When we look around, how do we know all this? When we look around, well, around the country, what are some lessons learned from peer agencies? The team went out and they asked quite a few questions about, okay, before we dive into this head first, is there anything that we should really think about? Anything that we want to make sure that our partners are aware of? And that we can, as we model different areas about where we would want to put microtransit, what do we need to know? So what we do know and what we heard is that microtransit is very popular. To be able to pick up a phone and use an app and get a ride from and to either a transit station or a park and ride or to the pharmacy is hugely popular. But you know, there's a lot of value in piloting. We're doing some pilots here. I think we'll talk about that before we end this presentation. But to see what works and what doesn't work, because not every community is the same and not every community is going to be receptive to every model. So piloting it to see what works for each local community within the bigger system is really something we need to make sure we do. We don't want to waste money by just throwing out a tons of service that no one uses. We want to make sure that we also have clear performance standards. We have performance standards for transit, you know, our cost per rider, our cost per mile, our number of peak boardings, average boardings. We know what works. Question is, what are those same service parameters? What's going to work for microtransit? Are we going to look at number of trips a day? Do we want to look at coverage area that's served? How do we know, and how are we going to be able to measure when we put these out there that they're being successful and they're being used? What are our thresholds? We want to make sure we establish those up front. I think one of the biggest challenges we're going to find is when we establish what those zones are, how big the zone is, how small it is. We have a lot of people who will want to be in a zone, whether or not they want to use it. The larger the zone is, the more expensive it can be because the distance being traveled is greater. Your zone's too small, then you restrict it and you exclude people, or maybe you exclude good destinations. So having that zone size is going to be very, very important. And the larger the size is, the more someone might have to wait for a service to come to them. And that also can be a disincentive or a barrier to using it. So finding that right zone size is pretty critical. Understand the market, of course, educating. If people don't know that the service is there and they don't know what it does, and they haven't been educated, of course, it will fail. If you don't know something exists, you're not going to ask for it. So we need to really work through that, and that we can't assume that everyone has an app. We know a lot of people have apps. We know a lot of people have smartphones, but not everyone does, especially when we start looking at some of our senior populations. I know both of my parents have smartphones. I also know that in their 80s, their use of the apps on those smartphones is questionable. So my own use of apps these days can be pretty questionable. So we can't always rely on that. We have to make sure we have multiple ways that people can access the service once we do put it out there. So we did look at peer agencies across the country. There's a lot more study that's going to go into this, but that helps us to set some boundaries around what our expectations should be as we move forward. That's a lot of words, a lot of talking. What does it mean for us? What are the next steps, and what are we doing here to make this happen in RVA? Okay, so the first thing is we're looking to develop areas where we would want to do microtransit, whether it's first mile, last mile, whether it's on demand, whether it's neighborhood circulators. We still need to kind of define those boundaries, not too big, not too small. Where are those boundaries? And we have a lot of data. And this is where I'm going to be a little bit critical of transit, is that we have an amazing amount of data that tells us exactly where we should be putting these microtransit zones. And I'm going to tell you that I don't trust that data because we haven't talked to you. We haven't talked to the communities yet. Specifically, we do have don't get me wrong, we've done a survey. We've got 1,000 responses. It was great. But we haven't talked to the economic development teams. We haven't talked to the housing teams. We haven't talked to the communities, the health resources. So when we get away from the areas that we know, we might be blind to information because we need that better together. We need that input from our partners to make sure that we're not doing this the way transit always does it. So we're in the process of zone identification. We do have some information, and I'll show you some on the zone evaluation and the service design. We have some of that, but those are super preliminary. And I caution that those are just based on that whole hammer and nail concept, that when you have a hammer, everything's a nail. What we're showing you is absent of your inputs. That's why it's important we get you part of this process now. So I'm going to go through kind of where we are with the transit side, where we are with our identifying our nails, and what we need you to do is help us identify the screws and the doors and everything else. Let's see. So typical microtransit. When we look at a typical microtransit focus, we're looking at three things from the transit perspective. Where are people coming from? Where are people going to? And the areas where they're most densely located, dense housing, dense jobs, where housing and jobs are densely located. Those are areas that we find work really, really well for transit because we can move more people more quickly, more efficiently, more effectively. So a lot of what you're going to see now is from that transit view. When you do that, this is what it looks like. This is where our density is. And this is from a transit perspective, where microtransit is most feasible and most effective. When you look at our region, that leaves a lot of area that's green for our region. And we know that there is microtransit need beyond just where our area is densest. So that's why, again, we're coming out to you to say, okay, the data is showing us where we know. Help us identify some of the areas we don't know. Next slide kind of starts to get into that. Where do people need to go? This spreads it out some more. This kind of starts to show that we do have those areas further out away from the urban core where we do have need to go. We have hospitals, we have schools, we have grocery stores, we have community centers, we have libraries, we have courthouses and social services. We have need to go to places throughout the region. So if we just looked at density itself, we'd be missing a whole lot of our region. But even so, remember, this is just what our data shows. There might be future locations of housing, future locations of economic development that our rural partners and our suburban partners and even our urban partners have knowledge of that they can share that we're still blind to. That's why it's critical that this is an iterative process and we'll hear back from you now. So we've got our data part, we need your part. When we get that, we then start getting to this idea about zone identification. The zone identification, if it left to transit alone, we're going to try and push things towards where there's the highest transit potential, the highest density, where there's the highest need, the highest population, and we're going to kind of move towards those. When we look at microtransit, we move a little bit away from that density perspective to the less dense. So that's kind of where we're kind of spreading further away from the downtown core where fixed route transit works so beautifully, move out into the rural areas. When we start looking at possible zones, what that shows us is that we have a lot of really good zones for possible microtransit, but we still have a lot of areas where transit showing there isn't really a strong need, there isn't a strong desire, there isn't a strong case, and I don't think that's real. I think that when we talk to each of you, when we talk to our partners, that we're going to find that there are some non-dense areas out there. There are some senior communities. There are some resources that need to be reached that we're not quite hitting when we look at it from the data alone. And while my team did a beautiful job to get us to this point, in order for us to get to the next point of identifying all the zones and then prioritizing them and then setting the demands of what kind of service is necessary, this is where we're going to be better together. This is where we need that input. And my team is going to be going out next steps to each of the different communities, to each of the housing coordinators, the economic development, each of the representatives from our partner organizations, to show them this data, show them a lot more data, and say, okay, now where did we miss it? Where are our priorities not aligning with your priorities? Where there are mobility needs that maybe you know about that we don't, and maybe here are some mobilities that we know about that you don't. And when we put all that together and we iterate, we can then start to put out some of the microtransit pilots. We can prioritize them, look at what works, look at the funding sources, how much they cost, and that's going to be the next steps. So I'm pretty excited that this is where we're at. I said I had 17 slides. I kind of lied. I only have 14. This is my last slide because I've got 3 more that are hidden. While I know I have a whole hour to talk, I would hope that it's okay with you all that I do stop talking here and start answering some questions. If you don't have any questions, I'll start talking a lot more. I also want to say that I have some of my staff and the consultants on the line as well. So in case you want to really go into the weeds on some of these questions, they're there to help me stay honest.
Thanks, Julie. Really appreciate that. And I have to just say, I really appreciate the shout out to the Better Together. It's evident that this has definitely been a group effort all the way around. So appreciative for that. We are ready to open up to questions. I think Julie has threatened that she can share more content as needed, but this is certainly the opportunity. If you'd like to raise your hand, we can enable you to ask your question directly. Feel free to also put a question in the chat that we can read or the Q&A section.
And like Martha, it is so true. If there are no questions, you know me, I have plenty of content to share, but I'd prefer to answer some questions.
I think we'll give the attendees a moment. And I think in the meantime, you talked a little bit about the next steps and the consultations. Can you repeat kind of the time frame for things and sort of what, if you will, sort of thinking about that, if there's energy to move forward, what are the next steps and what might that look like?
Sure. And so some of this is going to be solid and some of it's going to be squishy.
Sure.
It is an iterative process. We could, what I've directed the team to do, they're setting up meetings right now with representatives from each of the jurisdictions within CVTA. I didn't talk a lot about CVTA, but I believe that this really does, this initiative, while it's an initiative we should be doing regardless, I think it really has been accelerated because of the interest of the members of the Central Virginia Transportation Authority to really look at how mobility connections can be made in their areas. So each of the partners in CVTA will have meetings with my staff and my consultants to get some of that. They're asking that each of the counties and the cities that are a part of the CVTA also identify who their housing coordinator might be, their economic development team, to have that. And that would be happening over the next several weeks to next month, and pulling that back in. Once we have that information, we will relook at those zones, relook at the priorities, and discuss which of those might be highest on the list. I'd like to see, and this is where it starts getting squishy because it is iterative, I'd like to see a wide range of pilots throughout the entire region. I'd like to see some that are more rural based for maybe folks who need to get to social services in the rural areas that maybe live in poverty but less dense. I'd love to see one that's a senior services to help people get to food, to get to healthcare. I'd love to see one that's inside of some of our more urbanized areas to replace where our service maybe is less effective. That model of becoming more effective with on-demand inside a typical transit area. And I'd love to see some that are more park and ride based that get people who might want to use transit, they're just a little bit too far away. And once they're in their car, they don't get out of their car. So if we had that first mile, last mile to get from transit, they might try it and find that it really is liberating. So those are the ones we're looking at now. In order to get those in place, we do have federal relief dollars through COVID that we're setting aside. It will be up to the board to make a final decision, but we've put kind of an earmark on those to be able to pilot these, because we've learned so much in COVID about the accessibility needs of the entire region, that using that money to expand that accessibility will really help us determine the effectiveness of these models, that we can then prioritize and use some of the CVTA dollars to make these long-term investments in the community. So there's a kind of an immediate need to have that conversation with the communities over the next couple of weeks to months, iterate, prioritize, pilot, and then launch permanently. So we're looking at a couple-year process potentially.
Thank you for that. I think for those that aren't watching the chat, Nick is helping out, so I appreciate that. There was one question about, particularly around enthusiasm for outreach to Powhatan County. And while I don't expect you to rattle off the names of the individuals, who are the types of contacts in these local government outreach? Is it staff in the local planning or transportation departments? Is it elected officials? Can you give us a flavor of that?
Yes, all the above. We want to make sure that anyone who wants to be involved has an opportunity to be involved in this, but we absolutely need to be working with directors and staff of public works. They know where the roads are being developed. They know where the connections are. We need to be working with anyone who's working on housing and social services, because they're going to know where maybe some of the less dense property areas are that need better accessibility and better mobility. The healthcare folks, because they probably know where some of the seniors are who are there having to transport to get to medical care. So we need literally connections with all the different I hate to say they're siloed because I think they're not always, but all the different organizations that may or may not be siloed. We all need to come together to have that input so we can find areas that transit is typically blind to outside of urbanized areas. So I don't have a specific answer, but definitely want to meet with the city and county administrators. If the elected officials would like us to come, we would love to come and give them some more information. If they have meetings with the public where we can come out and provide information, the more education, the more knowledge about this, the better. So a lot of it's going to push it out, but I would love to get to a point where people are pulling it from us as well.
Awesome. Thank you for that. We've got a couple of questions in the chat and the Q&A. So I'm going to go through this, but we'll encourage people to type in more as Julie's responding to these. Two really interesting questions. I'll take them one at a time. One, how does the timing of this conversation impact your next steps? Are we still worried about operator shortages, other labor shortages? And do we think microtransit's value has increased since the introduction of COVID?
Okay, there's a couple there. So
It's a big question.
It's a great question. I'm really glad it's asked because it allows me to, one, brag, which I love to brag on the agency. So I'm going to start there. Yes, we have an operator shortage. There's a workforce shortage across the country. I think everyone's aware of that. And we have not been shy about saying it has impacted our service here in RVA. The good news is that compared to many, many agencies across the country, our workforce shortage is less than many because we haven't had as much of that, what do they call it? The great retirement, the great resignation.
Mm-hmm.
We haven't had much of that. Yeah, we've lost some people over the course of COVID because some people have resigned. They've been with us for 30 years. They're tired and they deserve their retirement. We have, of course, the natural loss of people who maybe just aren't working out for us. We haven't seen a significant loss of people because they're leaving to go work elsewhere, better pay, better opportunity, for whatever reason. But we haven't been able to hire over the past 2 years. So even a few losses, one or two people retiring or moving on a month over the course of a year is 20 people. Over 2 years, it's 40, 50 people. When you need 300 people to run a service, that's a lot. And we had some significant barriers to getting people back into the workforce. We did need to look at our pay rates. We had to look at the fact that we were preventing people from applying effectively because they didn't have their CDL. If they didn't have their CDL permit, we said, well, go get that and then come back. That's a high bar for someone to have to do, especially during COVID, to go to DMV and get their permit and to study for it when DMV itself was having issues getting people in and out. So we reduced those barriers. We're getting people in, we're training them for their permit, and our class sizes are bigger than they have been for a very long time. They're back to pre-COVID levels, and we have more class sizes every month than we've had for a long time. I think the last I talked to HR, we had about 100 applications and that they're trying to sort through for our next class. Now, most of those won't make it through, but our class sizes have been around 10 people every 4 to 6 weeks. I think that once we had a class back 2 weeks. So we are coming back, and we're coming back quickly, and we are retaining the people that we have at good rates. When we get our service back to normal, which we hope to have within the next 6 months to a year, all things knock on wood, because every time I say that, we get a new variant out. We'll be able to put our service back in place, and we'll be able to do the expansion. With the study time frame looking, like I said, in that 1 year plus ish time frame, I believe that gives us plenty of time to restore our workforce, expand our workforce, put the pilots out, and grow without being constrained by these issues. I think that we'll see that come along. So I think the second part of that was the importance of microtransit under COVID. I would say that that's a harder one to answer. What I really learned around COVID was the importance of local transit and how critical it was to the essential workforce. When we saw our van pools decline, we saw the express buses decline, because I'm going to go back to hammer and the nail. We're looking at everything from the bus perspective. We're not looking at it from the microtransit. We're not looking at it from the senior rides out in the rural. That's not where our service is. So my gut tells me that when we start reaching out to our partners throughout the region, they're going to tell us that they've seen that the mobility needs are stronger than ever and higher than ever in their areas. Certainly the mobility needs of our essential workforce was higher than ever under COVID, and we've done that. I think that we are going to find that we need to be pivoting how we serve people throughout the entire region, and microtransit is going to be the tool to do that. But I don't have that answer right yet because that's not where we have traditionally served.
Sure. Thanks for that. A couple kind of related questions that I'm going to sort of bundle together because I think they drive at the same thing. One listener is curious about the fare versus free fare basis. Another question came in about if there's any kind of opportunity for coordination with Medicaid and EMT. And then another question came in about sort of how does the fee structure work? Is this a provided service akin to the other GRTC services, or is it at an increased price? So kind of all those things I think drive it sort of the same theme there.
Yeah, no, those are great questions because, and some of it I have an answer for and some of it I don't. So when we're talking about zero fare versus fare, we are in this kind of, we're still in the COVID zero fare. We're trying to make sure that we have that separation and physical distancing between riders and the fare box and our operators. And we're still using our federal relief funds to support that. We were able to successfully get a grant from the state Department of Rail and Public Transportation and the Commonwealth Transportation Board and the state legislature. Thank you so much for the grant so that we can continue to study the impacts of fares on riders, the impacts of fares on the economy, the impacts of fare collection on our own business and revenue collection, and how to balance that. So I expect that we'll stay zero fare, all things equal, unless there's some major change. We find some data that shows that we shouldn't continue this route for potentially up to 3 years or longer. What does that mean for microtransit? Right now we have a care on demand program, and so our paratransit service is called our care service, which has been very confusing with the care relief money, two different things. So our care service is our paratransit service. A couple years ago, this agency did a care on demand, which was a door-to-door, you call and within an hour, you can get service that supplements our paratransit service. And that is not zero fare. That is still, I believe, $6 a trip. It's still well used, and it is outsourced to TNC providers. We have contracts that do that work. When we look at microtransit, chances are that this will be a similar model, at least to start. Whether or not it would transfer over to a zero fare operations if we stay there, or would stay in a fare-based model, that's still part of the conversation we have to have with our about the service design with our partners. And it depends on whether or not we find that zero fares really is a economic benefit to the region, and we would stay that. So there's a lot in there. If fares come back, if we find that that really is the model that this region needs to have in place as a fare-based service, I would like to see us coordinate better with the Medicaid and the social services and the staff and the different programs so that we can have some kind of program so people who have higher needs for mobility also are not impacted and burdened by the higher costs of mobility that come with fares. So we don't have that in place now, but if fares do return, I definitely want to see that program advance. Did I miss a question? There was a lot bundled in there.
There was. No, I think you did a great job kind of covering the range of those. You mentioned a moment ago TNCs, transportation network companies, and one of the questions actually relates to that. How do you think they might factor in or support or play a role in the provision of microtransit?
Well, I've got to separate my personal feelings from my professional feelings here, because I think that there's some TNC providers, and we have one, user Route Match, there's a couple of them that we have here who have provided some exceptional partnerships with us. I'd love to see how they can support those throughout the region. And I think there's absolutely some partnership there as well. But at the same time, I also want to see us support my own operators. I want to see my own operators have the opportunity to take on this new service model. We give good benefits. We are an economic driver for people who have maybe less education that get into the workforce, maintain the workforce, have pensions, have health care. And I'm very proud of what we're able to provide for our employees. And so I would love to see us develop an in-house microtransit TNC division that could provide this. So I think, I don't know until we actually get into some pilots and we move forward, that we will probably see a blended version where some of the microtransits operated by our own staff as we expand, and we provide that employment benefit and that accessibility benefit to our staff and our community. But I also think there's definitely a place for TNCs to support. My caution would be as we look across the country about some of the TNC models and what their long-term business model is. What does that look like, and how can we partner with it? Is their business model to go to autonomous vehicles and to cut out the workforce altogether? And in some cases that makes economic and business sense. In some cases in this region, there might be a model where we should be implementing that. And how does that work? Is that something GRTC does? Is that something that the TNC does? We definitely need to stay up to speed on these technology changes and these business models, because I don't have a clear answer on which one. We have a wide range of opportunity, and which ones, I think there's going to be many, work here. I think it's hasn't been determined yet. We'll do that together because we're better together.
Thanks, Julie. This audience does not slack in the question, so I'm going to throw another one at you that came in through the Q&A. Do you know what the views of organized labor are concerning microtransit and sort of how that plays into maybe what you just spoke about?
I'm not gonna say I know for sure. We have had communications with our union. We do have a union, and they have expressed concerns over how this would impact the union, whether or not we would be outsourcing and pulling the labor away from them, or how they would come back into our contract with them. Our collective bargaining agreement, I should say, originally had a small transit vehicle provision long ago that I hope that we can bring back and modify so that we can provide this benefit and provide organized labor an access into this. As far as what their official position is on it, I don't know. I hope to work together with them though to make this work.
Thanks. Another question that came in, going in a little bit of a direction, just thinking about this, and I know that this is a question that you get a lot, but I think the structure and the governance of GRTC is kind of regularly out in the public sphere. How the question is kind of geared, I think, a little bit more toward like, how do you think about that, or how does the GRTC board think about that as it relates to microtransit in some of the areas that haven't historically been served by GRTC?
I think there's a lot of potential. When I first got here almost 2.5 years ago, time flies, there was a lot of excitement around the possibility of expanding the role of GRTC, but there's also a lot of hesitancy around that. GRTC in this region traditionally has been the bus operator. That's it. That's what GRTC was. You were the bus operator. And now here we're coming into this new era with CDTA and with more regional collaboration of, does GRTC provide a public mobility service for the entire region in a greater way beyond just operating buses? And what does that mean for our funding sources? What does that mean for the input and the governance of our urban, suburban, and rural partners? There's a lot of conversation we're going to continue to have. Now, I will say that we are working very, very closely with Richmond and Chesterfield and Henrico, and I'm very excited that hopefully very, very soon we will have an expanded board, and Henrico will be part of that partnership to develop these priorities as we expand our local bus routes. And we will continue to work with the TPO, and we will continue to get our approvals to the CDTA to make sure that everyone has a fair opportunity to have a weigh-in on the priorities for the regional funding for these microtransit, coverage, frequency, traditional transit. I know I keep kind of smiling, saying better together because that's the theme of this, but I truly believe that we are better when we come to the table together and we look at all the different priorities. Now, not everyone's going to get everything they want, but when we look at everything openly, we balance the needs of everyone. We will create a better system, and then we'll identify what are the opportunities to grow next. So yeah, I think our board is excited for the opportunity to do more and grow more, and to be more than just a bus drivers. We are mobility providers, and we are connected to providing access and to creating that opportunity for people to get to healthcare, to get to parks, to have a better life, and to see our role as integral to that for the region.
Thanks so much for that, Julie. I'm going to pivot and ask a question since I get another one that came in right now. I saw in one of the early slides of your deck that the study kind of, I think, was predicated on a set of peer regions, and I'm always curious, how do you define those? What characteristics of those communities, kind of parallel ours?
That's a really good question, and I'm the team themselves. If any of them want to raise their hand and say how they came up with these peers, I'll let them do that. But usually, what we look at is geographic size. We look at the components of the population, what the density is, the characteristics of the transit provider, the characteristics of how many people are using transit, how many people are using cars. So there's a wide variety of factors that determine what a peer agency might be. And so a lot of times it's also defined based on what you're trying to study. So a peer agency that's a peer agency for microtransit wouldn't be the same peer agency we would look at for implementing a North-South BRT. But I skimmed over it because my team online can give you a much better answer than I can.
Thank you. That was great. We did get another question in the chat, in the Q&A. And this one's interesting, I think, in light of what you just spoke about with, kind of being more than the operator. How should we approach the provision of supporting infrastructure, such as sidewalks, benches, bus stops, et cetera? And I think that's particularly interesting. This is my part of reading that question. It does seem like it's, a lot of different parties kind of coming together to make this system work. So what does that look like in your mind?
Yeah, so there are a lot of frustrations and joys in what I do. And I think the infrastructure issue is definitely one of the frustrations, because we are right now still a bus operator predominantly. We're dependent on a lot of different decision matrices, a lot of different decision makers on where we put sidewalks, where we put bus stops, where we put shelters, whether or not we can have a mid-block crossing, whether or not there is a crosswalk in an intersection or more pedestrian lights, where we put park and rides. A lot of those, while we identify where the need is, a lot of times we have a lot of roadblocks in getting all the partners at the table to agree to where they should be, how they should be, what the priorities are. Mid-block crossings, for example, is a particularly hot topic amongst folks, whether where you put a bus stop and whether or not the cars or the pedestrians or the buses or the bikes have priority. So I'm kind of stumbling on this answer a little bit, because it takes VDOT, it takes the counties, it takes the city, it takes us, it takes the public works all coming together to be able to define these areas where the needs are, where the stormwater is, and how to address the infrastructure needs to make transit work better, and to balance the needs and priorities of the bus and the pedestrians and the bicyclists and the truckers and the ambulance drivers and the school buses and the cars, all within a very, very, very narrow right of way. This is one it's challenging. Because we have a strong need for dedicated lanes for buses, but we also have a strong need for dedicated lanes for bikes. And we have a strong need for emergency vehicles to be able to go fast down the roads. And we have a strong need to slow down cars so pedestrians and seniors can get across at intersections. When we look at infrastructure and how to balance all those needs, it's a very complex conversation, and it slows us down a lot. And I know a lot of our riders and a lot of the community is very frustrated by that, as I think all of the partners are as well. So I didn't have a good answer for that one, because I think we are still, as a region, working through how to do that. I've seen a lot of improvement over the past 2 years since I've been here, and I think we're making headway, but we still have some work to do.
Thanks so much for that. I think just have probably time for one more question. Julie, I'll throw you one just to sort of think a little bit to the future. It's still January 2022, so I'll call it still the new year. What are you looking forward to most this calendar year?
Oh, that's a good question. I'm a little afraid. Sometimes I've put out my goals and my plans, and COVID has laughed each time. So we're going to go with rainbows and unicorns here. I am looking forward to having a really large shelter program. I don't know if we'll be able to launch it, but I want to have a plan in place so that if we get the money and we break down the barriers, that we can move fast on more shelters and more benches for the region. There's a lot of work that needs to get done, but if we don't at least have them identified on locations, then we can't get them put in the ground. So that's from our part. I want to do that. I'd like to see us get a good start on the North-South BRT. Now, DRPT, the TPO, Greater Washington Partnership, so many people have been working on this idea about a North-South BRT. We need to look at our next steps, where the alignment is, where the logical termini are to start and end it, what kind of development or land use planning needs to be put in place now to support us moving towards that, what's the right phasing. And I think that this is the year we can really make some headway towards that, looking at locally preferred alternatives, alignments, looking at how to fund it in the future, and start laying the groundwork so that when we're ready to put it in the ground, literally, we've got everything in place. I'm looking forward to really putting those priorities in place. I cannot wait to put some of these microtransit pilots in place and seeing how effective they are and seeing where we can really pivot as that mobility provider. And working with our partners coming together, I'm seeing so much work from housing and from land use and transportation organizations, from the economic development teams, where people are really coming together in ways that I think maybe didn't happen as much pre-COVID, to talk to each other and make sure that we're moving we're moving the bar together forward and making really good sound decisions collaboratively. And I'm really excited about seeing that happen. And I'm very excited to see that we're going to have some governance changes on the GRTC board. I really am looking forward to better partnerships in moving forward the BRT and the shelters. So I'm gonna, there's so many things. I have a whiteboard behind me that y'all can't see. You should thank me that I hit it with a huge list of projects that we're trying to say, okay, what are our top priorities? And we'll be talking with our partners about, and our board about which ones should come first. But there's a long list of things that we can do to help make mobility better in this region.
I don't think anyone could call you unambitious. So we're really, in all seriousness, appreciative for you spending an hour with us today, but also for the work that you do in service to the region. We're getting a lot of feedback that I didn't call out during the session from folks who are really grateful for the information that you've provided today. We've got some folks who have conveyed that they'd like to kind of stay aware of what's going on. Some of those folks are participants on the Community Transportation Advisory Committee for the TPO. So we'll definitely, I think our staff will make a commitment to, keeping everyone in the loop on things that we are aware of that's happening in the GRTC orbit. So thank you.
That real quick before you, I should have mentioned that before, but since you brought it up and since they've said that communication piece is the hardest for us and hardest for most agencies. If you're not hearing from us, pull the information, reach out to us. We're looking for new ways and innovative ways to reach the community and reach our partners. And it's so frustrating for everyone when we miss that connection. So if you want us to come out to you, want us to hear more, you know where to find me. I'll come out myself, or we'll send staff out in person, virtually. But please, if you want to hear more, we will come to you. Please let us know.
Well, thank you for that. Appreciate that. Well, we are just about time. I'm going to make just a couple of kind of closing announcements. I just wanted to say, Julie, again, thank you very much for your time today and preparing for this and putting the slide deck together, and also for the work that you do in partnership with us. Those of you who haven't been before to our webinar series, it is the Better Together webinar series. I feel like Julie's ingrained that in our heads today. But I wanted to make a couple of announcements about some of the upcoming sessions that we have, particularly if this is your first time, maybe you'll join us again. Next month, February 17th at 2 o'clock, we're going to be focusing on the Richmond Regional bicycle and pedestrian planning efforts. So We're going to keep the course on transportation over the next 2 months, and it'll be a great opportunity for participants to learn a little bit about what's happening in that exciting planning project, and maybe even give a little bit of input. So we're definitely looking forward to that. March 17th, we're going to switch gears and hear from Javon Burton from Partnership for Housing Affordability. Some folks on this may have participated in the recent State of Housing program. I think it was last week up at the Weston and Henrico County. But we'll have Javon here to talk about what's happening in the space of affordable housing across our region, and probably talk about some partnerships. And then in April, on April 21st, we'll be hearing from the Port of Virginia. So we try really hard to kind of curate the content for these webinars, not just to focus on the work that PlanRVA does, but our partners. And we're really grateful for all the partnerships that we have in the community. It's certainly not exhaustive of all of the amazing things that are happening across the region, but it is an opportunity for us to shine a light on these stories of collaboration and how many hands make many hands make the work lighter. So Julie, thank you again for being here today. The team from GRTC, I know a number of you are on today and listening, and certainly we appreciate the work that you all are doing, not just for the microtransit study, but all around. I see a number of local and state officials that are on the list today, and so we thank you for your time. And certainly all of our partners and community members, we're grateful for you spending an hour with us to learn a little bit more about what's happening in the area from GRTC.
Thank you.
We'll see everyone on February 17th at 2 o'clock. If you are not getting regular updates about our Better Together webinar series and would like to, please reach out to us. You can reach out to info@planrva.org. That's info@planrva.org. Just let us know whether you'd like to get signed up for the distribution list for the Better Together series. You can also look out for announcements on our website, on our calendar, social media. We too work to put information out as many channels as we possibly can, and certainly would love to hear from you if you're interested in learning more. So thanks everybody. Have a great afternoon, and we will see you in February. Julie.